On the silver screen, she was the epitome of Southern grace and undeniable beauty. Audiences remember her radiant smile as the beloved Nurse Peggy McMillan, capturing the heart of America on television. They remember her holding her own alongside cinematic giants in the noir masterpiece Touch of Evil. On the surface, she had it all. But underneath, little did they know, this was just a beautiful facade masking a profound and silent agony. How does a rising star, with the entire world at her feet, suddenly lose everything? How does a breathtaking Hollywood actress end up passed out in a cold bathtub with a glass of wine and a bottle of barbiturates within arm's reach? The truth behind her tragic fall from grace is a chilling story of childhood trauma, toxic romances, and inner demons that simply refused to be silenced. This is what really happened to Joanna Moore. Before we dive into the heartbreaking final act of this legend's life, shout out your city in the comments. Grab a drink, find a quiet spot, and stay with me as we peel back the layers of this old Hollywood mystery. To understand the Hollywood tragedy of Joanna Moore, we must first travel far away from the flashing lights and the glamorous red carpets of classic cinema. We must journey back to the deep American South. On November 10, 1934, in the quiet town of Americus, Georgia, a little girl named Dorothy Joanne Cook was born. She was a child of a difficult era, yet her earliest days were filled with the simple warmth of a complete household. She had a loving mother, a father, and a younger sister, making a cute little family. For a brief and fleeting moment, young Dorothy had a normal life. But destiny had written a much darker script for this future star. The psychological scars that would eventually destroy her began with an unimaginable childhood trauma. When Dorothy was just 7 years old, a horrific tragedy struck her innocent world. Her parents and her little sister went out for a routine drive, but for some fateful reason, they left young Dorothy behind. It was a random decision that spared her physical life but condemned her soul. A devastating car accident occurred on that very outing. Her mother and her younger sister lost their lives instantly in the violent crash. In the blink of an eye, half of her world was violently wiped away. Her father managed to survive the initial impact of the accident, but his physical condition was in very rough shape. He clung to life for a few agonizing months, but before that same year was up, her father passed away too. At merely 7 years old, little Dorothy had lost her entire family. She was left entirely alone in the world, carrying a heavy burden of grief. The aftermath of this profound loss only deepened her silent agony. Thankfully, she had her grandmother, who took her in so at least she had a place to live and a temporary shelter from the cold reality. Sadly, this small comfort would not last long. Her grandmother was elderly, and her declining health soon made it impossible for her to take care of her growing granddaughter. Once again, the little girl found herself abandoned by circumstance and in desperate need of a secure place to live. A local wealthy family eventually stepped forward and decided to adopt her, offering what looked like a true miracle. However, their charity came with a bizarre and cruel condition. They demanded that she drop her birth name Dorothy and change it completely to Joanna. In order to survive, she had to erase her own identity. The little girl who lost her family now lost her very name. Living in a posh but emotionally rigid household, Joanna felt suffocated. The trauma of her past and her forced new identity created a deep void inside her heart. She desperately sought love and wanted control over her own destiny. When Joanna was just 16 years old, she made a desperate and impulsive bid for freedom. She threw her comfortable home aside and found a teenage boy named Willis Moore and impulsively married him. It was a reckless attempt to build the family she had lost, but the illusion shattered quickly. The two youngsters soon realized their massive mistake and divorced before their 1-year anniversary. She lost a teenage husband, but she walked away with something far more permanent: She kept his last name. The shattered orphan Dorothy Cook was gone forever. She was now Joanna Moore, ready to take on the world and run straight into the seductive arms of Hollywood. Following the bitter end of her teenage marriage, Joanna enrolled in a private college named Agnes Scott. But the quiet halls of academia could not contain a young woman trying desperately to outrun a haunted past. While at college, she stood out not for her academic skills but for her undeniable and striking beauty. Realizing her physical appeal was her greatest asset, she quickly signed herself up for a local beauty pageant. Winner of the Georgia Beauty Contest was the ultimate turning point. The extraordinary results propelled her far away from her painful memories, straight to the glittering streets of Hollywood. It was a world built entirely on illusions, making it a perfect hiding place for a girl with a shattered identity. Her entry into the film industry reads exactly like a classic Golden Age fairy tale. Shortly after arriving in Los Angeles, Joanna attended a Hollywood cocktail party. In a room full of aspiring hopefuls, a prominent studio producer caught a glimpse of her striking features. Captivated by her southern charm and melancholic eyes, he offered her a screen test right on the spot. Universal Studios executives liked what they saw and immediately signed her up to a contract. Joanna Moore was officially a working actress. However, her first leading role in the feature film Appointment with a Shadow was a massive critical failure. The New York Times coldly noted it had as much novelty and enchantment as a popcorn machine in the lobby. After a second impulsive and brief marriage to fellow actor Don Orek, she realized she needed a massive career breakthrough to survive the brutal machinery of Tinseltown. Refusing to fade into obscurity, Joanna returned to the cocktail party circuit where she met producer Albert Zugsmith. Zugsmith was sitting on a cinematic gold mine called Touch of Evil. This was no ordinary picture. It was a dark, psychological noir directed by the brilliant Citizen Kane filmmaker Orson Welles. The cast featured monumental stars like Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh. Joanna desperately wanted in on this masterpiece. There was only one hurdle. Both Joanna and Janet Leigh were blondes, and the studio dictated the film could not feature two blonde actresses. Recognizing the magnitude of the opportunity, Joanna dyed her hair brown without a second thought. It was a small price to pay to share the screen with true cinematic legends. While waiting for another major leading movie role, Joanna conquered the television landscape. She easily found success on the small screen, appearing as a highly requested guest star on incredibly popular television shows like The Rifleman and Perry Mason. By 1962, her relentless persistence paid off when she secured a fascinating role in the feature film Walk on the Wild Side. Playing Miss Precious, a deeply neurotic lady of the evening, allowed Joanna to channel her own internal pain into the complex character. The performance resonated deeply with viewers. She later revealed that she received more fan letters for playing Miss Precious than for any other role in her entire career. This critical attention elevated her name big enough to work with absolute royalty. Joanna was cast to star opposite Elvis Presley in Follow That Dream. Sharing the screen with the king of rock and roll, she was the picture of pure, glamorous perfection. To solidify her mainstream status, Joanna transitioned to the most beloved television program in the country, The Andy Griffith Show. Playing Nurse Peggy McMillan, she stepped into the role of Sheriff Andy Taylor's girlfriend during the third season. America instantly fell in love with her sweet voice and enchanting presence. Audiences thoroughly adored her dynamic with the famous sheriff. She herself stated that working on the show was highly enjoyable due to its honesty and organization. At this moment, Joanna Moore stood at the absolute pinnacle of fame. Her sweet yet profoundly mysterious beauty mesmerized directors and audiences alike. She had transformed from a traumatized orphan into a captivating Hollywood siren, working alongside Orson Welles, Charlton Heston, and Elvis Presley. Industry insiders viewed her as a rising superstar capable of delivering both vulnerable drama and undeniable charm. On the surface, she possessed everything a woman could ever desire. She was a shining star in the golden age sky. But as the applause grew louder, the haunting whispers of her childhood trauma began to echo loudly in the dark corners of her mind. Behind the glittering facade of Hollywood success, the cracks in Joanna Moore's life were beginning to widen into deep, dark canyons. While her beauty and talent were undeniable, her experiences on film sets often revealed a much harsher reality than the polished images seen on screen. During the filming of the classic Touch of Evil, the environment was far from glamorous for the young actress. In one instance, Joanna made the innocent mistake of sitting in the chair of the legendary director Orson Welles. Welles, known for his temper, rudely screamed at her in front of the cast and crew. Coming from a well-mannered background in Georgia, she was stunned by such blatant disrespect, later stating she had never been treated so thole-bout by a man. The professional pressures were compounded by predatory behavior from her co-stars. Charlton Heston, her lead in Touch of Evil, reportedly had a significant crush on her and made persistent, unwanted advances. Joanna had to work tirelessly to avoid him, at one point barely managing to escape his dressing room after he lured her inside. These behind-the-scenes struggles were just the beginning of a series of events that would test her resolve and sanity. Adding to her professional stress was a terrifying and sudden medical crisis. Out of the blue, Joanna completely lost her hearing. Doctors diagnosed her with otosclerosis, a condition that could have been inherited from her family. For any actor, losing the ability to hear co-stars and directors is a career-ending nightmare. But Joanna refused to quit. She developed a secret solution, teaching herself to read lips so she could follow the scripts and conversations. She even coordinated with directors to have them tap her on the shoulder when it was time to begin a scene, as she could no longer hear the shout of action. For a full year, she managed to hide her deafness from most of her peers until a successful operation in 1962 finally restored her hearing. However, her personal life was becoming increasingly scandalous. While filming Follow That Dream with Elvis Presley, the King's charms led to a disastrous emotional spiral. Though they were briefly involved, Elvis soon turned his attention to another co-star, Anne Helm. Joanna, already showing signs of instability, could not handle the rejection. In a desperate bid for attention, she showed up at Elvis's home, shouting in slurred words and demanding to see him. When his security refused, she claimed she had taken a large quantity of sleeping pills and was pregnant with his child. This resulted in an emergency trip to the hospital where doctors pumped her stomach. The pregnancy claim was proven to be entirely false, leaving her reputation in tatters. Even her successful stint on the Andy Griffith Show ended in scandal. Despite being loved by the audience, she was fired after only 4 episodes. Years later, it was revealed that she had been having an affair with the married Andy Griffith, making her presence on set an uncomfortable liability for the network. Seeking stability, Joanna met actor Ryan O'Neal. He was handsome, rising in the industry, and notably 7 years her junior. What looked like a perfect Hollywood match was actually a union built on a shaky foundation. They tied the knot on April 3, 1963. But the marriage was an impulsive response to a secret they were hiding. Joanna was already pregnant. Their first child, Tatum, was born just 5 months after the wedding. Ryan would later be described by his own children as a narcissistic psychopath, and the marriage was marked by angry, loud fighting from the very start. As Ryan's career soared with Peyton Place, Joanna's own career began to fade, fueling a devastating descent into substance abuse. The Southern beauty queen was now trapped in a toxic cycle of addiction and a loveless marriage, unaware that the worst was yet to come. As the 1960s progressed, the golden light that once illuminated Joanna Moore's career began to flicker and dim, creating a painful contrast with the rising star of her husband. While Ryan O'Neal found massive fame and fortune on the hit primetime soap Peyton Place, Joanna watched her own professional opportunities evaporate. This divergence in their paths fueled a toxic atmosphere within their home, leading to a domestic life defined by angry, loud fighting. Behind closed doors, the beautiful Southern belle was drowning in a sea of substance abuse, trying to numb the pain of her fading glory and her fractured marriage. The depth of her despair was revealed in a haunting scene that Ryan O'Neal would later describe as a turning point in their tragic union. One afternoon, Ryan walked into a bathroom looking for his wife, only to be met by a sight that would haunt him for years. Joanna had passed out in the bathtub, her body limp and unresponsive against the cold porcelain. Within her reach sat a glass of wine and the bottle of barbiturates, a clear sign that the woman he had married was being consumed by her addictions. This was not the mother he wanted raising his daughter, yet the cycle of instability continued. In 1964, they welcomed their second child, a son named Griffin, but even the arrival of a new baby could not mend the shattered foundation of their household. By 1967, the marriage was officially over, and the fallout was devastating. Recognizing that her problems with addiction were too big to handle alone, Joanna initially made the difficult choice to drop her children off at Ryan's home. She knew she needed to get control over her life and checked herself into a hospital for treatment. At the time, she believed she was doing her children a favor by placing them in a safer environment. But the reality of the O'Neal household was far from a sanctuary. Years later, the truth about Ryan's parenting would emerge. Tatum O'Neal recalled suffering from her father's own drug problems, while Griffin simply labeled his father a narcissistic psychopath. Ryan himself would eventually admit that he was a hopeless father. When Joanna finished her treatment and got out of the hospital, she was determined to get her children back. She succeeded in regaining custody, but the version of a new leaf she promised was nothing more than an illusion. Sadly, the treatment had not helped her at all, and she remained as unfit a mother as she had been before. Tatum later described their life during this period as a nightmare of neglect and deprivation. She and her brother were often starving, shoeless, and ragged, living in a state of chaos that no child should ever endure. Joanna was no longer the polished actress the public adored. She was a woman completely lost to her inner demons. The environment Moore provided for her children became increasingly bizarre and dangerous. While she was supposed to be providing stability, she instead allowed a revolving door of various boyfriends into their lives. One of the most shocking relationships involved a 15-year-old boy. Joanna was 35 at the time, and this teenage boyfriend became a constant presence in the house, hanging out with Joanna while young Tatum and Griffin were left unsupervised. The age gap between the boyfriend and Joanna's daughter was smaller than the gap between Joanna and her lover. This lack of supervision led to heartbreaking incidents. One night, the 6-year-old Tatum walked around the house, collecting sips from abandoned open bottles of booze until she was more than a little tipsy. Joanna was far too preoccupied with her own partying and substance use to notice her young daughter was becoming intoxicated. Even worse, some of the men Joanna brought into the household were cruel and physically abusive, beating Tatum and her brother. Tatum later recalled that her mother was on staff all the time, a fact that was visible in the decay of her mother's teeth and the volatility of her temper. The final, decisive blow to Joanna's life as a mother came on an evening that began with a visit to Malibu. Joanna had taken the children to see their father, but an argument quickly broke out. In a state of high emotion and intoxication, an inebriated Joanna got into her car with the children and attempted to drive away. She was clearly over the legal limit, and it was only a matter of time before officers pulled her over. The arrest for impaired driving was the ultimate evidence of her inability to care for her children. The legal system, which usually favors keeping children with their mothers, was forced to intervene in an extreme way. The court took the children away from Joanna and handed them over to Ryan O'Neal. It was a total and humiliating collapse for the former beauty queen. She had lost her career, her husband, and now the very children she had tried to reclaim. As her career entered a full nosedive, Joanna Moore found herself standing at the bottom of a very deep and lonely well with no clear way to climb back to the light. The transition into the late 1970s marked the beginning of a bleak and desolate chapter for the woman once hailed as Georgia's most beautiful export. By this time, Joanna Moore's career was no longer just stalling. It was in a full, uncontrolled nosedive. The industry that had once been enchanted by her southern charm had grown cold and indifferent, leaving her with a dwindling bank account and a name that no longer opened doors. She was a veteran actress in her mid-40s, but in the eyes of Hollywood producers, she was a liability, shadowed by rumors of instability and substance abuse. With less money coming in and her professional reputation in tatters, she found herself in a desperate search for a new source of income just to keep a roof over her head. In a cruel twist of fate, as Joanna's light was extinguished, her young daughter's star was rising to heights Joanna herself had never reached. Tatum O'Neal was taking the film world by storm, demonstrating a raw and natural talent that far exceeded her years. In 1973, at the tender age of 10, Tatum won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role in the film Paper Moon, which she had starred in alongside her father, Ryan O'Neal. While the world celebrated the youngest Oscar winner in history, the irony was not lost on the industry or the public. The mother, who had once been the star of the family, was now an observer of her child's massive success. This success brought with it a role reversal that was as practical as it was painful. Because Joanna was unable to secure meaningful work, she was forced to accept financial support from her own daughter. Having her daily expenses and lifestyle paid for by a child could only have felt completely and utterly humiliating for a woman who had once prided herself on her independence and beauty. The very daughter she had once neglected was now the only reason she was not living on the streets. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and rather than serving as a wake-up call, this humiliation seemed to drive Joanna further into the comfort of her addictions. Her descent into substance abuse continued to manifest in dangerous ways. Despite previous legal troubles and the loss of her children, Joanna continued to get behind the wheel of a car while under the influence. The authorities continued to pull her over, but even the threat of jail time could not break the cycle. Eventually, the luck that had kept her alive during her years of recklessness finally ran out. Joanna was involved in a devastating car crash that left her with permanent physical reminders of her self-destruction. In this accident, she tragically lost 3 of her fingers. For a woman whose identity was so closely tied to her physical appearance, this maiming was another low point in a life already defined by loss. Even in the wreckage of her later years, Joanna tried to grasp at some semblance of a normal life. She continued to take small, forgettable television parts whenever they were offered, clinging to the profession that had once defined her. She also entered into a 4th marriage, perhaps hoping that a new partner could provide the stability she had never been able to provide for herself. But the ghosts of her childhood and the trauma of her failed marriages with Ryan O'Neal continued to haunt her. She was a woman who had lived several lifetimes in a few short decades, but as the 80s arrived, she was living in a state of quiet, desperate obscurity. A forgotten star in a town that never looks back. By the mid-1990s, the once glamorous world of Joanna Moore had shrunk into a quiet and painful existence. The woman who had once stood alongside cinematic legends was now a shadow of her former self. But a final blow was waiting in the wings. In 1996, she received a medical diagnosis that was far more aggressive than any of her past addictions: lung cancer. It was a cruel irony for an actress who had spent her life in the high-pressure environments of Hollywood studios and the even darker rooms of her own personal struggles. This illness was an enemy she could not charm or outrun. Throughout 1997, the cancer slowly drained what little strength Joanna had left. She had spent decades battling internal demons, from the trauma of losing her entire family in a single year to the heartbreaking loss of her children to the courts. Yet, in the final act of her life, there was a glimmer of reconciliation. Despite the years of starvation and neglect, her daughter Tatum did not abandon her. In November 1997, as the end approached, Tatum was right there by her bedside, offering a final measure of love to the woman who had struggled so mightily to be a mother. Joanna Moore passed away at the age of 63, a life cut short by both physical disease and a lifetime of emotional wreckage. Her remains were treated with the respect she often lacked during her tumultuous years in the spotlight. Her ashes were carried back to her roots and spread across the earth of her hometown in Georgia, returning the Southern beauty queen to the soil from which she had first bloomed. It was a quiet end to a life that had once been lived in the deafening roar of applause and the harsh glare of camera flashes. Looking back at the legacy of Joanna Moore, one sees a haunting portrait of a talent buried by wounds that never truly closed. She was an actress of profound depth, yet she was always a prisoner of her past. The girl who was forced to change her name to Joanna never really went away. She spent her life searching for the security she lost on that tragic Georgia road, often looking for it in the arms of narcissistic men or at the bottom of a bottle. Her story is a stark reminder that even the most radiant star cannot shine if her internal world is shrouded in darkness. Joanna Moore was a woman of immense potential who was ultimately silenced by the echoes of her own childhood trauma. The journey of Joanna Moore was a haunting odyssey that began in the wreckage of a Georgia highway and ended in the quiet morning of a Hollywood bedside. She was the little girl who lost everything: her mother, her sister, her father, and even her very name, all before she reached the age of 10. She clawed her way to the pinnacle of the film industry, transforming herself into a vision of Southern elegance that captivated audiences and icons alike. Yet the applause of the world was never loud enough to drown out the persistent echoes of her childhood trauma. In the end, she became the architect of her own heartbreaking downfall. A tragic figure who eventually traded her children's safety and her own dignity for the temporary numbness of a bottle. Her life stands as a stark and somber testament to a singular, painful truth. Talent and beauty are not shields against a broken spirit. You can win the heart of a nation. You can star alongside the kings of cinema. And you can even watch your own child reach the heights of an Oscar. But if you do not find the strength to heal the wounds within, those wounds will eventually consume everything you have built. Joanna Moore was more than just a tabloid headline or a Hollywood scandal. She was a woman who spent her entire adult life trying to outrun a tragedy that had already caught up to her. If you were moved by this deep dive into the shadows of Tinseltown, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to ensure these incredible narratives are never forgotten. We want to hear from you. Do you think Hollywood destroyed Joanna Moore, or was her destiny sealed long before she ever stepped onto a movie set? Share your memories of her work and your perspective in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and until our next journey into the archives of the past, stay tuned.